They laughed at the cowboy who built a house that let the wind inside. In a desert town where heat crushed lungs and storms tore roofs from homes, Rowan Blackwell did the one thing everyone said would get him killed. He didn't fight the wind, he listened to it. When the night came and the storm chose its victims, walls fell, roofs flew, and families ran with nowhere left to hide. But one unfinished house stayed standing, and the people who walked through its door would never see shelter the same way again. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Silver Mesa, New Mexico, was a small desert town shaped by heat and wind. In late summer, the days began hot and ended hotter. The sky stayed clear for weeks at a time, and the sun pressed down without relief. Wind moved through the area almost constantly, slipping between buildings, carrying dust and fine sand that settled everywhere. People in Silver Mesa learned early that weather was not something to complain about. It was something to endure. On the western edge of town, where pavement gave way to dirt and scrub, Rowan Blackwell stood on a piece of land few others wanted. The ground dipped slightly and caught wind from multiple directions. There was no shade and little vegetation. Rowan bought it anyway. Rowan was 33 years old. He worked as a cowboy, spending most of his time moving cattle between dry pastures. His body reflected that life. Lean, balanced, and strong without excess. His skin was darkened by the sun, his hands rough from rope and fence wire. Dark hair fell just past his collar, usually kept under a worn hat with a misshapen brim. A short beard framed his jaw, giving his face a sharp, serious look. His eyes were calm and observant. He spoke rarely, not because he lacked confidence, but because he preferred listening. Several years earlier, Rowan had witnessed a fatal accident on the range. A horse spooked, a rope snapped, and a man was dragged before anyone could intervene. The event left Rowan quieter than before. Since then, he measured his actions carefully and avoided unnecessary noise. Rowan began building his cabin alone. He brought in salvaged lumber from a collapsed barn and lower-grade boards purchased cheaply from a nearby sawmill. He worked steadily, setting posts, framing walls, and raising beams without assistance. What caught attention was not that he was building, but how. Instead of sealing his walls tightly, Rowan left narrow, deliberate gaps between certain boards. He installed windows that could rotate and see vents near the roofline. Interior supports were angled slightly rather than set straight. The structure looked unfinished to anyone familiar with traditional cabins. It appeared open, exposed, and impractical. By the third day, people began talking. Silver Mesa had few distractions. Conversation filled the gaps. At the diner and the saloon, Rowan's cabin became a topic of discussion. Most agreed it would fail. Hank Doyle said it first. Hank was 56, broad and heavy-set, with thick shoulders and a sunburned neck. His gray hair was cut short, and his mustache was stiff and untrimmed. He had worked as a builder for decades and was known for solid, conservative construction. Years earlier, a severe windstorm had damaged one of his buildings. Since then, he trusted tight walls and sealed roofs above all else. Standing near Rowan's land one afternoon, Hank watched him work. "You planning to live in that thing?" he called out. "Or just listen to the wind?" Several batailles. People laughed. Rowan did not respond. He checked his measurements and continued working. Hank shook his head. "Wind's gonna move in before you do." Rowan treated the comments as background noise. He focused on his work, moving slowly and deliberately. Later that day, Sarah Lane walked out to the site. Sarah was in her early 60s, tall and thin, with a straight posture that suggested long years of steady labor. Her hair was silver and braided over one shoulder. Her skin was fair, marked lightly by sun and age. She owned the general store near the center of town and was known for being practical and direct. Widowed years earlier, she carried herself with quiet resilience. Sarah stopped a short distance from the structure and watched Rowan work before speaking. "You're taking your time," she said. "Heat makes mistakes worse," Rowan replied. "Better to go slow." She handed him a paper sack. "Food. You've been out here all day." Rowan accepted it, with a nod. Sarah looked over the framing. "People think this won't hold." "People usually do," Rowan said. "They're not all wrong," she replied. "Weather out here isn't forgiving." Rowan took a drink from the canteen she handed him. The water was cool with a slice of lemon inside. That's why I'm building it this way. Sarah studied the angled supports and open gaps. What do you call it? A wind house? She considered that for a moment. That's new. Not really, Rowan said. Just uncommon? Sarah gave a brief smile. Hank won't like it. He doesn't have to. Before leaving, she looked toward the horizon. The air shimmered and the wind shifted direction. Feels like a hard season coming, she said. Rowan followed her gaze. Feels like it. As evening approached, the wind strengthened. It moved through the unfinished structure and produced a low, controlled sound as it passed through the gaps Rowan had built. He paused, placed his hand against one of the beams, and felt the vibration move through the wood. The sound was steady, predictable. In town, people continued to smile at the idea of a cowboy building a house that welcomed wind. Rowan returned to his work and drove another nail into place. The desert remained quiet above them, clear and blue, offering no sign of what it was preparing. The wind did not leave Silver Mesa after sunset. It stayed, moving through the town long after the heat of the day faded, slipping between buildings and across empty streets as if it were learning their shapes. By early August, people began to notice that the nights felt different. Not cooler exactly, but unsettled. The air shifted direction without warning. Dust no longer settled by morning. It hung, fine and persistent, coating windowsills and water buckets alike. Rowan Blackwell noticed first because he was awake when most others slept. His cabin was rising steadily now. The frame stood complete, the walls partially clad, the roof structure begun but not sealed. At night, Rowan often sat on an upturned crate inside the skeleton of the house, boots planted on packed dirt, listening. The wind moved through the angled supports and vents exactly as intended, entering low and exiting high, never stagnating. It carried heat out with it, leaving the interior noticeably cooler than the hull. Open desert beyond the walls. Rowan didn't smile at that. He simply acknowledged it, the way a man acknowledges a tool doing its job. With him, most nights was his horse, Calder. Calder was a 12-year-old bay gelding with a broad chest and long, clean legs, the kind built for endurance rather than speed. His coat was dark brown with a black mane streaked faintly with gray near the roots, a sign of age rather than neglect. One ear bore a small notch from an old barbed wire incident, and his left eye held a faint cloudiness that never fully healed after a winter infection years back. Despite that, Calder was steady and calm, a horse that did not spook easily. Rowan trusted him the way one trusted solid ground. Calder had been Rowan's since his late teens. After the range accident that took Rowan's friend, Calder had been the horse Rowan rode back into town that day, blood on his flank, breathing hard but obedient. Since then, the two moved together with an understanding that didn't require reins pulled tight. That week, Rowan also gained another quiet companion. A dog appeared one morning at the edge of the property and never left. The dog was medium-sized, likely a mixed breed, with coarse tan fur and a darker stripe running down his back. One ear stood upright while the other folded slightly forward, giving him a permanently questioning look. He was lean to the point of thinness, ribs faintly visible beneath his coat, and his paws were scarred, suggesting long days on rough ground. His eyes were amber and cautious, but not fearful. He kept his distance at first, watching Rowan from the shade of a mesquite bush. Rowan didn't call to him. He left a bowl of water near the frame and went back to work. By evening, the dog had moved closer. Sarah Lane noticed the changes before most people admitted them out loud. At the general store, she listened to customers complain about spoiled grain, restless livestock, and doors that slammed despite calm skies. She kept her responses brief, practical. Still, she found herself looking west more often, toward the low hills and Rowan's rising structure. One afternoon, she walked out again, this time with a sack of nails and a ledger tucked under her arm. Rowan was fitting roof supports when she arrived. "You're not sealing the roof yet," she said, observing. "Not until I finish the secondary pitch," Rowan replied. Sarah frowned slightly. "Most folks put a roof on to keep wind out." "That's why most folks are hot at night," he said. She watched him work for a moment. "Hank's been asking questions." Rowan paused, then continued hammering. "About?" "About load distribution, about why your supports aren't straight." That caught Rowan's attention. He glanced at her. He didn't ask me. Sarah shrugged. Hank doesn't like asking. Across town, Hank Doyle was indeed watching more closely now. The laughter had faded, replaced by something closer to irritation. He stood near his own workshop one evening, shirt dark with sweat, watching a newly installed roof panel flex under an unexpected gust. It held, but barely. Hank scowled. He'd built it right. He always did. Yet the wind that summer felt different, more persistent, less predictable. Years ago, when Hank's workshop roof tore loose in a storm, he'd sworn never to give weather an opening again. That loss had shaped his methods, hardened them. He believed in force meeting force, seal the gaps, brace the walls, fight back. Seeing Rowan's open structure offended that belief. By midweek, Rowan's cabin was visibly cooler inside by late afternoon. Word of it spread, quiet and grudging. A few men stopped by under the excuse of curiosity. One was Elias Moreno, a ranch hand in his late 40s, broad-shouldered with a thick black beard shot through with gray. Elias had hands like rough wood and a manner that suggested patience earned the hard way. He stepped inside Rowan's cabin and wiped sweat from his brow. "Feels different," Elias said simply. "Air moves," Rowan replied. Elias nodded. "My place traps it." That night, the wind strengthened again. It pressed through town, rattling signs and pushing sand against doors. Rowan sat inside the cabin, the dog curled near the wall now, sleeping lightly. Calder stood tied nearby, calm. The sound the house made was steady, controlled. It did not groan or rattle. It breathed. Farther into town, a small incident went mostly unnoticed. A weather vane atop the old feed store twisted violently, snapped its bolt, and fell. No one was hurt. Still, Sarah marked it in her ledger under repairs. The next morning, a dry storm rolled in without rain. Wind-driven dust reduced visibility to a few yards. Work stopped across town. Rowan kept building. Hank watched from a distance, jaw tight, mustache bristling. He told himself he was only concerned about safety. He told himself that when Rowan's structure failed, someone would have to clean up the mess. But as the dust storm passed, Hank noticed something that unsettled him. Sand had piled against most buildings, pressed into doorways and vents. Rowan's cabin, by contrast, had less accumulation near its walls. The wind flowed through instead of colliding. That evening, Sarah brought news. Weather Service out of Flagstaff issued an advisory, she said. They're seeing unusual pressure patterns moving east. Rowan listened. Nothing official yet, she added, but it's early. Rowan looked toward the horizon, where the sky remained clear, deceptively calm. Early doesn't mean harmless. By the end of the week, the dog had moved fully into the cabin. Rowan named him Ash, after the color dust left on his fur. Ash followed Rowan quietly, alert but unintrusive. He barked only once, late one night, when the wind shifted suddenly from the north. Rowan woke immediately. He stood in the doorway, feeling the air change. It carried a sharpness now, subtle but distinct. Behind him, the windhouse responded as designed, channels guiding the flow, pressure equalizing instead of building. Rowan went back inside and marked a note in his small notebook, one line only, wind staying longer. He did not know what was coming yet, but he was no longer alone in sensing it. The chapter closed with Silver Mesa moving as usual on the surface, unaware that the wind had begun choosing sides. By the second week of August, the heat in Silver Mesa changed its character. It no longer rose and fell with the sun in predictable cycles. Instead, it settled. Mornings began warm, afternoons turned punishing, and nights failed to bring relief. The air pressed down as if weighted, and even when the wind moved, it carried warmth rather than release. Livestock grew restless, water barrels emptied faster, people slept lightly, waking often without knowing why. Rowan Blackwell adjusted his routine without announcing it to anyone. He rose earlier, worked through the worst of the heat inside the partially finished cabin, and shifted heavier labor to late evening. The roof structure was now complete in form, though not sealed. Two distinct pitches rose from the frame, the upper one steeper, set to intercept wind before it reached the lower layer. Between them, a continuous airspace ran the length of the roof, open at the edges but guided by internal baffles Rowan had added carefully. It was not visible from a distance. From the road, the cabin still looked unfinished, even crude. Up close, its logic became clearer. Inside, the difference was no longer subtle. By mid-afternoon, the interior temperature remained noticeably lower than outside. Not cool in the way people imagined comfort, but stable. The heat did not collect. It passed through and moved on. Ash lay near the interior wall, stretched on his side, breathing evenly. His coat had begun to fill out slightly in the days since he'd arrived, ribs less prominent now. He followed Rowan closely, never underfoot, always alert. Calder stood tied in the narrow shade cast by the structure, head low, tail flicking lazily. Horses in town had grown irritable in the heat. Calder had not. Word traveled in Silver Mesa without ceremony. By midweek, more people found reasons to pass by Rowan's place. Some came openly. Others slowed as they drove past, windows down, assessing. Few spoke at first. One who did was Jonah Reed. Jonah was 39, tall and angular, with long limbs that made him look slightly unfinished, as if he'd grown faster than coordination could follow. His face was narrow, nose sharp, jaw lined with a thin, uneven beard that suggested neglect rather than style. He wore his hair tied back at the nape, dark and streaked with dust. Jonah worked intermittently hauling freight between towns. The work suited his temperament, solitary, unpredictable. Years earlier, a business partnership had ended badly, leaving him cautious with people and quick to assume disappointment. Jonah stopped near the cabin one afternoon, wiping sweat from his neck with a faded bandana. "You know," he said, not unkindly, "I thought this place was going to cook you alive." Rowan glanced up. "Still time." Jonah stepped closer into the shade of the frame. He paused. "Feels different." Rowan nodded once. "Air doesn't stay." Jonah studied the roofline, eyes narrowing. "Hank says you're asking for trouble." "Hank thinks trouble only comes one way." Jonah smiled faintly. "He's not always wrong." "No," Rowan agreed, "just not always right." Jonah stayed another minute, then left without further comment. That evening, he slept with his windows open for the first time in weeks, hoping for a similar effect. Across town, Hank Doyle's mood continued to sour. His workshop had grown unbearable by late afternoon, heat collecting under the sealed roof despite every vent he'd added. He snapped at a younger helper and later regretted it, though he didn't say so. Hank wasn't a cruel man. He was rigid. The accident years ago had taught him that weakness invited loss, and he'd built his life around eliminating it. Seeing Rowan's structure succeed by doing the opposite unsettled him more than he admitted. Sarah Lane noticed the strain on her customers. People lingered longer in the store, not to buy, but to escape the heat. She rearranged shelving to improve airflow, propped the back door open, and kept pitchers of water near the counter. When she visited Rowan again, she stayed longer. "The store's not holding heat the way it used to," she said, "but it's still worse than here." Rowan leaned against a support beam. "Wood stores heat. Air moves it." Sarah considered that. "People don't." "No," he said. "They stay where they are." That night, the town experienced its first power interruption of the season. It lasted only an hour, but it was enough. Fans stopped. Refrigerators went quiet. The absence of sound felt sudden and alarming. Rowan lit a lantern inside the cabin. The flame burned steady, protected from gusts by the layered structure. Ash lifted his head once, then settled again. In town, tempers flared. Children cried. Someone fired up a generator that sputtered and failed. When the power returned, it brought relief, but also unease. The next morning, a small group gathered near Rowan's place without coordinating it. Elias Moreno arrived first, followed by Jonah Reed. Two others lingered near the edge, one of them Clara Watkins, a schoolteacher in her early 50s, short and compact, with tightly coiled dark hair and eyes that missed little. She stood with her arms crossed, taking in the structure with measured interest. "You mind explaining it?" she asked Rowan directly. Rowan wiped his hands on his jeans. "Depends how much time you've got." Clara stepped into the shade. "Enough?" He spoke simply, pointing out airflow paths, the way pressure equalized rather than built. He did not use technical language. He described what he'd observed, what worked, and what didn't. Elias listened with the attention of a man used to evaluating land and weather. Jonah asked a few pointed questions. Clara said nothing until the end. "You're not fighting the heat," she said finally. "You're giving it somewhere to go." Rowan nodded. "That's the idea." The group dispersed quietly. No one laughed. That afternoon, the heat peaked higher than it had all summer. Metal surfaces burned to the touch. Even shade offered little relief. Rowan worked inside the cabin, fitting interior panels that could be adjusted seasonally. The dog followed him. Calder remained calm. Near sunset, a sudden stillness settled over Silver Mesa. The wind dropped entirely. Dust hung suspended, unmoving. The silence felt wrong. Rowan stepped outside, eyes scanning the horizon. The sky remained clear, but the air felt tight, compressed. He'd felt this once before, years ago, before a violent storm broke unexpectedly over open range. Ash growled softly, low in his throat. In town, Sarah closed the store early. Hank stood on his porch, uneasy, watching the sky. Jonah secured his rig. Elias brought his cattle in closer than usual. The wind returned after dark, abrupt and forceful, slamming into buildings before finding its paths. Rowan's cabin responded smoothly, channels guiding the surge upward and out. Inside, the air shifted but did not press. A loose sign tore free from a storefront down the road. No one was hurt. Still, it rattled nerves. Late that night, Rowan wrote again in his notebook. Heat no longer lifting, pressure building. He closed the book and set it aside. Silver Mesa slept uneasily, unaware that comfort was becoming a resource rather than an assumption. The morning after the sudden stillness, Silver Mesa woke to a heat that felt compressed, as if the air itself had been packed tighter overnight. The sky remained clear, but the light carried a dull edge, bleaching color rather than brightening it. Wind came in short bursts instead of steady flow, striking walls and fences before slipping away. People moved more slowly. Conversations were shorter. The town behaved the way animals did before a storm, cautious, without understanding why. Rowan Blackwell felt the change as soon as he stepped outside. It wasn't temperature alone. It was resistance. The air pushed back when he breathed, subtle but unmistakable. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking fastenings, running his hands along joints and braces. Everything held. The upper roofline, still open at the edges, waited for the next movement of air like a set jaw. Calder shifted his weight, ears rotating independently, tracking sounds beyond sight. Ash stood near Rowan's. Boots, posture alert, tail low. The dog had stopped wandering at night. He stayed close now, choosing proximity over exploration. Rowan fed both animals, then went inside to adjust the interior panels he'd installed the day before. These were not permanent walls, but slatted sections that could be repositioned, redirecting airflow depending on season and pressure. He moved one panel a few inches and felt the air respond immediately, easing through the space instead of pressing down. The house answered small changes with measurable results. That reassured him. In town, the first sign of trouble came mid-morning when a delivery truck stalled at the edge of Main Street. The engine overheated despite modest speed and a full radiator. The driver, Martin Cole, climbed down and kicked the tire in frustration. Martin was 42, compact and muscular, with a square face darkened by years of road work. His beard was trimmed close, more habit than fashion. He'd grown up poor and learned to snade. Early that broken equipment meant lost pay. When the engine finally died, he swore once, then went quiet. People gathered. Heat radiated off the truck in visible waves. Someone fetched water. It took nearly an hour to get the engine running again, and even then it sounded strained. Martin drove off slower than he'd arrived, eyes fixed ahead, jaw set. By noon, the general store had become the town's unofficial shelter. Sarah Lane kept both doors open and rotated customers through the cooler aisle in small groups. She noticed more people asking the same question in different ways. Was this normal? She answered carefully. Normal changes, she said, but it doesn't announce itself. Hank Doyle avoided the store that day. He stayed in his workshop, fighting heat with fans that only pushed hot air from one corner to another. Sweat soaked through his shirt. He stripped it off and worked bare-chested, muscles rigid with irritation. When a roof panel creaked overhead, he froze. The sound wasn't new, but it lingered longer than it should have. Years earlier, after his workshop roof had torn loose in a windstorm, Hank had rebuilt it heavier than necessary. Thicker beams, fewer openings. He'd sworn never again to let weather find a weakness. That decision had served him well, until now. The sealed space trapped heat like a lid on a pot. He considered opening a vent, then dismissed the thought. Openings invited failure. He'd learned that the hard way. Mid-afternoon brought a new sound to Silver Mesa. A low, distant hum that rose and fell without clear source. It wasn't machinery or traffic. It came and went with the wind, like pressure finding seams. People paused when they heard it, then resumed what they were doing, unwilling to give the feeling more weight than necessary. Rowan heard it clearly inside the cabin. He adjusted one of the upper vents, widening it by a fraction. The hum diminished. He made a note in his book. By late afternoon, a small group formed again near Rowan's place, drawn less by curiosity than by discomfort elsewhere. Elias Moreno arrived with his hat pulled low, beard damp with sweat. Jonah Reed followed, shoulders slumped, eyes rimmed red from poor sleep. Clara Watkins came last, carrying a notebook instead of folding her arms this time. They stood in the shade of the cabin without speaking for a moment. "It's worse today," Jonah said finally. "Feels like it's pressing down." "It is," Rowan replied. Clara glanced at him. "You're sure?" "I don't guess." Elias shifted his stance. "My cattle won't settle. They're breathing heavy." Rowan gestured them inside. The change was immediate. The air moved. It didn't cool dramatically, but it loosened. Shoulders dropped. Breathing eased. Clara exhaled slowly. "You didn't seal it?" "No." "And it doesn't shake," she added. Rowan shook his head. "Pressure needs somewhere to go. They listened as a gust struck the exterior, split along the roofline, and passed overhead without rattling the frame. Jonah looked up instinctively, then relaxed. "People are going to start asking questions," Clara said. "They already are," Elias replied. Hank Doyle watched from across the road, unseen. He'd followed Elias out of town without meaning to, curiosity pulling harder than pride. Standing there, he felt the difference too, even from a distance. The way Rowan's cabin handled wind contradicted everything Hank believed about strength. It didn't resist. It redirected. A sharp crack echoed from town, a wooden sign tearing loose under a sudden gust. The sound carried clearly. No one moved for a moment. "That's the third one this week," Jonah muttered. Hank turned away before anyone noticed him. He walked back to his workshop with long, heavy steps and stood inside, hands on hips, staring up at his roof. Sweat dripped from his nose onto the concrete floor. The heat felt personal now, like a challenge. He fetched a ladder. In the early evening, the wind rose abruptly, stronger than before. It came from the south this time, carrying grit that stung exposed skin. Rowan closed the lower intake vents and widened the upper channels. Inside, the airflow increased but remained controlled. Ash paced once, then lay down. Calder shifted but stayed calm. In town, someone's porch awning tore free and slammed into a parked car. No one was injured. The noise traveled. Sarah locked the store early and walked home with her shoulders squared, eyes scanning the street. She passed Hank's workshop and noticed the ladder leaning against the wall. From inside came the sound of metal being pried loose. Hank worked barehanded, prying open a section near the roofline. Hot air rushed out immediately, striking his face like a breath released. He froze, then widened the opening. The relief was undeniable. The structure groaned softly but held. He stepped back, breathing hard, and stared at the opening as if it had betrayed him. Night fell with unusual speed. The sky darkened without clouds, stars sharp and cold-looking despite the heat. The wind did not stop. It circled, testing structures, changing direction without warning. Rowan stayed awake. He walked the interior perimeter once more, checking fasteners, listening. The house responded to each shift with a change in tone rather than force. That mattered. Near midnight, a brief power outage rolled through town again, shorter than the first but more unsettling. Lights blinked out, then returned. People remained awake afterward, listening. Rowan wrote another line in his notebook. "Structures that trap pressure will fail first." He set the pencil down and rested his hand against the wall. The wood was warm, but steady. Outside, the wind moved on. Silver Mesa did not sleep well that night, but for the first time, some people began to consider that survival might depend less on fighting the environment and more on understanding it. The heat broke its pattern the following day, not by easing, but by holding. It stayed fixed, heavy from dawn through dusk, as if the air had decided to occupy space permanently. The wind came and went in short, aggressive runs, striking structures and then disappearing, leaving silence behind. Silver Mesa moved carefully, conserving energy. Doors opened and closed more often than usual. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People listened for sounds they couldn't quite name. Rowan Blackwell spent the morning reinforcing the upper roof edges, not with heavier material but with adjustments, changing angles, widening channels, tightening fasteners where vibration had increased the night before. He worked without urgency. The house had taught him its responses. He followed them. Ash stayed close, tracking Rowan's movements with quiet attention. The dog's posture had changed over the past week. He no longer hovered at the margins. He lay where Rowan worked, rose when Rowan rose, and slept only when the air settled. Calder grazed in short intervals, lifting his head frequently, ears turning at distant sounds. Horses felt pressure before people did. Calder had begun shifting weight more often, but he didn't panic. He trusted the space. By midday, the general store closed. Sarah Lane put up a handwritten sign that read, "Closed until evening. Heat advisory." It wasn't official. It didn't need to be. People understood. She carried what she could home and left the rest. The cooler hummed, then stopped when the power cut again. This time, longer. 30 minutes, then 45. Inside homes, air thickened. Fans stalled. Ice melted. The heat did not spike. It accumulated. Hank Doyle felt it building in his workshop. The opening he'd pried loose the night before helped, but not enough. The air escaped slowly, reluctant. He sat on an overturned bucket, forearms braced on his knees, chest rising and falling with effort. Sweat ran into his eyes. He wiped it away and stared at the ladder still leaning against the wall. He thought about the first roof he'd ever built with his father. Simple, light. It had failed in a windstorm when Hank was young, tearing loose and scattering boards across a field. No one had been hurt, but the fear had stayed with him. His father rebuilt heavier the next time. Hank had learned that lesson well. Strength meant resistance, or so he'd believed. Across town, Jonah Reed knocked on Clara Watkins's door. She answered wearing a loose cotton dress, hair pulled back, face drawn from the heat. "Power's still out," Jonah said. "My place is an oven." Clara nodded. "Mine too." They stood there for a moment, neither wanting to say what came next. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Jonah asked. She exhaled. "I am." They walked together toward the western edge of town, where Rowan's cabin stood. Others had the same idea. Elias Moreno joined them halfway, hat in hand, beard damp with the sweat. Two more followed at a distance. No one spoke much. The wind picked up briefly, pushing at their backs, then died again. Rowan saw them coming. He stepped outside before they reached the structure. "You don't have to ask," he said. They entered in small groups. The difference was immediate and undeniable. The air inside didn't trap heat. It moved gently, guided, drawn upward and out through the roof channels. It was not cool. It was tolerable. That was enough. People stood, then sat. Some leaned against walls. Ash moved among them once, then settled near the center of the space. Calder shifted outside, visible through the open side, calm. "This isn't magic," Jonah said quietly, as if saying it louder might break something. "No," Rowan replied. "It's allowance." They stayed as the afternoon stretched into evening. No one suggested leaving. The sun dropped, but the heat remained. Outside, the wind returned in short, forceful gusts, striking and moving on. Inside, the structure adjusted, the sound changing, but never rising to panic. More people arrived as word spread, quietly, without announcement. Sarah came near dusk, carrying a small bag of supplies. She took in the scene without comment, then set the bag down and sat near the wall. "How long?" she asked Rowan. "However long it takes," he said. The power returned briefly, then failed again. This time, it did not come back. Night fell unevenly. The stars appeared sharp and distant. Outside, the town lay mostly dark. Inside the cabin, lanterns burned low and steady. The air continued to move. Hank Doyle arrived just after full dark. He stopped at the edge of the property and stood there longer than necessary, shoulders hunched, hands flexing. He looked older in the lantern light, the lines on his face deeper, the certainty he wore for decades finally thinned. He removed his hat before stepping closer, a small gesture that did not go unnoticed. Rowan met him, halfway. They stood without speaking for a moment. "I didn't come to argue," Hank said finally. His voice was rough, scraped thin by heat and pride. Rowan nodded. "Then don't." Hank stepped inside. The air shifted around him. He stopped short, eyes closing for a fraction of a second before opening again. He exhaled slowly, deliberately. "You didn't seal it," he said, not accusing this time. "No." Hank walked the perimeter once, hand trailing along a support beam, feeling vibration without rattle. "You let it move." "Yes." Hank swallowed. I built everything to stop that." Rowan said nothing. Hank's shoulders dropped slightly. He sat on the floor near the wall, back straight, hands resting on his knees like a man learning a new posture. He did not look at anyone. The wind rose sharply near midnight, stronger than any gust before. It struck the cabin hard, testing edges, pressing against the roof. The structure responded as designed, splitting the force, releasing pressure upward. The sound inside deepened but did not shake. People froze, listening. Outside, something crashed, metal tearing free, then silence. Inside, the lantern flames flickered once and steadied. No one spoke for several minutes. Ash lifted his head, ears forward, then lay back down. When the wind passed, the cabin returned to its baseline rhythm. Breathing resumed, shoulders relaxed. "They'll come again tomorrow," Sarah said quietly. Rowan nodded. "I know." "And after that," Elias added. Rowan looked around the room. People sat where they could, close but not crowded. The house held them without strain. "We'll adjust," Rowan said. "It can take it." He meant the structure. He might have meant the town. Late that night, as people slept lightly on the floor or leaned against walls, Rowan walked the interior once more, checking fasteners, listening. The house answered with steady airflow. He returned to his notebook and wrote a single line. First night shared. Structure held. He closed the book. Outside, Silver Mesa lay dark and uneasy, but for the first time since the heat had changed, no one inside the wind house felt trapped. The morning after the first shared night did not arrive gently. The sun rose behind a pale haze, its light diffused as if strained through dust that had not yet fallen. The air felt heavier than before, no longer merely hot but burdened, carrying a pressure that resisted movement. Wind arrived early, not in bursts this time, but in a sustained flow from the southwest, steady and deliberate, as if it had chosen a path and intended to keep it. People woke inside Rowan Blackwell's cabin with stiff limbs and shallow sleep behind them, but without the headache and nausea that had plagued them in their own homes. No one rushed to leave. Instead, they sat quietly, adjusting to the realization that this place had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just Rowan's Altinish cabin. It had become something else. Rowan moved among them without ceremony, checking vents, shifting panels by inches, responding to subtle changes in sound and airflow. The house spoke in tones now, low when pressure increased, higher when it released. He listened the way a rancher listened to cattle at night, knowing when a noise mattered and when it didn't. Ash followed him closely. The dog's coat had grown noticeably cleaner despite the dust outside, his amber eyes clear and focused. He was still cautious with strangers, keeping his distance, but he no longer flinched at raised voices or sudden movement. Whatever life he'd lived before had taught him when to leave. This place had taught him when to stay. Calder remained tied nearby, shifting his stance more frequently than usual, hooves scraping the ground in short, controlled motions. Horses did not like pressure changes, but Calder did not pull. He trusted Rowan's judgment more than his instincts. As people stirred, Sarah Lane took inventory without being asked. She counted faces, noted who looked pale, who needed water, who needed quiet. She moved with purpose, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back tighter than usual. The puss. Years she'd spent managing a store in a town that depended on supply lines and weather had sharpened her sense of triage. Hank Doyle woke sitting upright against the wall, eyes open, jaw clenched. He had not slept. The night had given him too much to think about. He watched Rowan work for a long time before speaking. "That sound," Hank said finally. "When the wind shifts. That's intentional." "Yes," Rowan replied. Hank rubbed his beard, fingers dragging slowly through the gray. "I've spent my life trying to stop that sound. And now?" Hank hesitated. "Now I'm hearing it differently." Outside the cabin, Silver Mesa showed signs of strain. Loose debris littered the streets. A section of fence had collapsed overnight, posts pulled loose where the soil had dried and cracked. One of the older adobe buildings near Main Street had lost part of its outer plaster, exposing fragile brick beneath. The wind had not grown violent yet, but it had grown persistent. That was worse. By mid-morning, the southwest wind intensified. It carried a different quality, dry but sharp, scouring rather than pushing. Rowan closed the lower windward intakes and widened the leeward exits. Inside, airflow increased but remained directional. Heat moved out instead of settling. In town, less adaptive structures began to suffer. Tin roofs rattled continuously, wooden siding flexed, nails working loose with each oscillation. The sound of strain became constant. Jonah Reed returned to his place briefly to retrieve supplies. He came back with a bruised forearm and a new caution in his eyes. "My roof's starting to walk," he said quietly. "Not lifting yet, but it's thinking about it." Others shared similar reports. No one dramatized them. There was no need. By early afternoon, the wind shifted again, this time veering south and increasing in speed. It no longer tested structures. It leaned on them. Dust clouds rose along the outskirts of town, reducing visibility. The sky dimmed slightly, though no clouds appeared. Rowan stepped outside and studied the horizon. He'd seen this pattern before on open land, pressure systems colliding without storms to relieve them. When weather had nowhere to break upward, it broke sideways. A truck pulled up near the cabin, brakes squealing slightly as the driver overcorrected against the wind. The man who climbed out was unfamiliar to most. His name was Thomas Hale. Thomas was in his late 40s. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a deliberate way of moving that suggested both confidence and restraint. His hair was dark, cut short, and his beard neatly trimmed, more habit than vanity. His face bore the calm seriousness of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected others. He wore a county utilities jacket, dust-stained but clean. "I'm here to assess infrastructure risk," Thomas said without preamble. "Power grids unstable, substations running hot." Sarah stepped forward. "We've had outages." "I know," Thomas replied. "They'll increase." He turned to Rowan, eyes scanning the structure. "This yours?" "It is." Thomas studied the roofline, the vents, the angled supports. "You're letting pressure pass." "Yes." Thomas nodded slowly. "Smart." Hank noticed. The word landed heavier than it should have. By late afternoon, the wind reached sustained speeds that made conversation difficult outdoors. Rowan closed off the open side of the cabin partially, leaving enough intake to prevent stagnation. The interior darkened slightly as dust thickened outside, but the air remained breathable. Then came the first real failure. A sharp crack echoed from town, followed by a metallic scream. A section of roofing from a hardware shed tore loose and sailed into the street, slamming into a parked vehicle. No one was hurt. The sound carried all the way to the cabin. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. People inside the cabin froze, listening. Another crack followed, closer this time, wood snapping under stress. Rowan moved quickly but calmly, adjusting internal panels to redistribute airflow. The house responded immediately, releasing pressure upward. The sound deepened, but did not escalate. Thomas Hale stepped inside the cabin, eyes narrowing as he felt the difference. "This is the only place not amplifying the load," he said. Outside, the wind took on a steady roar, no longer gusting but pushing. It found every sealed surface and leaned until something gave. Hank stood abruptly. "My workshop's on the wrong side of this," he said. Rowan met his gaze. "Don't go." Hank hesitated, then sat back down, the decision visibly difficult. He'd spent a lifetime running toward problems. This time, he stayed. As dusk approached, the wind did not ease. It strengthened. Dust turned the sky a dull amber. Visibility dropped. The sound of distant impacts punctuated the air. Inside the cabin, people sat close, but not panicked. The structure held. Ash lay near Rowan's boots, calm. Calder shifted but remained controlled, the sound of his breathing steady. Thomas Hale spoke quietly to Rowan. "If this keeps up, we'll lose older structures tonight." Rowan nodded. "I know. You built this for yourself," Thomas continued. "You didn't plan for this many people." "No. But it's holding." "Yes." Outside, another structure failed, this time with a long grinding collapse that carried unmistakable finality. Someone near the back of the cabin began to cry softly. Sarah moved to them without a word. Rowan checked his notebook one last time before night fully set in. Wind has chosen a direction, weak points responding first. He closed the book. Silver Mesa was no longer facing discomfort. It was facing a test, and the outcome would depend on which structures understood how to yield. Darkness did not arrive all at once. It crept into Silver Mesa unevenly, swallowed by dust and pushed sideways by the wind. The sky held a dim, amber cast, as if the sun had set behind a wall rather than below the horizon. Wind continued its steady push from the southwest, no longer searching for weakness but exploiting what it had already found. Structures that had endured the day now faced the strain of sustained force, without relief. Inside Rowan Blackwell's wind house, people settled into a tense rhythm. No one spoke loudly. Every sound carried weight now, the scrape of a boot, the shift of a shoulder, the steady breathing of Calder outside the partial enclosure. Lanterns cast soft, uneven light across faces drawn thin by heat and fatigue. Sweat dried slowly, leaving skin tight and uncomfortable, but the air moved. It did not press. That difference mattered more than comfort. Rowan remained near the center of the structure, moving when necessary. Still otherwise, he had adjusted the roof channels to their widest stable configuration, allowing pressure to rise and escape without building. The sound of the wind passing over the upper pitch was constant now, a deep, controlled rush rather than a violent rattle. He listened for changes in tone. So far, none came. Ash lay close to Rowan's boots, body stretched but alert, ears rotating at every external impact. The dog was no longer merely cautious. He had chosen his place. His coat bristled slightly when the wind surged, but he did not bark. He watched. Outside, Calder stamped once, then settled. Rowan stepped out briefly to check his tie. The horse's eyes were wide but steady, muscles tense beneath his coat. Rowan laid a hand against Calder's neck, feeling the vibration travel through flesh and bone. "Easy," he said quietly. Calder breathed out through his nostrils, long and slow, and stood. Across town, the wind found another weakness. The sound reached the cabin seconds before the sight, a prolonged crack followed by the heavy collapse of wood and metal. Someone inside flinched. Sarah Lane closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, already moving toward the source of the sound in her mind. Years of managing inventory and loss had trained her to respond without panic. She placed a hand on the shoulder of a young woman seated near the wall and guided her into a steadier posture. "That was the old Miller place," Jonah Reed said quietly. "Roof was patched twice this year." No one corrected him. It didn't matter whether he was right. What mattered was that it was gone. Thomas Hale stood near the open side of the structure, coat pulled tight, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. He held a radio in one hand, thumb resting over the transmit button. It crackled with broken updates. Transformers overheating, lines down, signals fading. He did not speak into it yet. There was nothing useful to add. Hank Doyle sat rigidly against the wall, knees drawn. Up, arms wrapped loosely around them. The lantern light caught the lines in his face, deepening them. His beard, usually stiff with certainty, hung damp and heavy. He had spent his life believing that strength meant resistance. Tonight, that belief had nowhere left to stand. He cleared his throat. "If this keeps up," he said, voice rough, "half the older builds won't make it through the night." Rowan did not disagree. They weren't built for sustained lateral load. Hank swallowed. Neither were mine. The admission sat heavily in the air. Another impact sounded, closer this time, a shorter collapse, sharp and final. Ash lifted his head, then rested it back down, eyes still open. Then came shouting, faint at first, carried by the wind, then clearer. Voices calling names, someone calling for help. Rowan moved immediately. He grabbed a lantern and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. Dust reduced visibility to yards. He could make out movement near the road, figures stumbling against the wind. "Inside!" he called. "This way!" 3 people emerged from the haze, moving awkwardly, fighting the push of the wind. One stumbled and nearly fell before Rowan reached him. The man was Victor Bell, early 50s, lean to the point of gauntness, with sharp cheekbones and a salt and pepper beard that had grown unevenly over the past weeks. Victor worked maintenance for the town, quiet, dependable, often overlooked. A partial hearing loss from an old equipment accident had left him sensitive to vibrations rather than sound. Tonight, that sensitivity had driven him out of his collapsing home before it fully failed. Behind him came Lena Bell, his wife, small and compact, her dark hair pulled tight against her scalp, eyes wide but focused. She supported a teenage boy, Evan, their son, tall and underfed, arms shaking with exhaustion. They crossed the threshold into the wind house and stopped abruptly, disoriented by the sudden change. The air did not push. It moved. Lena exhaled sharply and pressed a hand to her mouth. Evan sank to the floor, back against the wall, breathing hard. Victor closed his eyes and stood still, feeling rather than listening. Our roof started lifting, Victor said once he found his voice. Walls were singing. You got out in time, Sarah said, already handing Lena water. Others followed, not in a rush, but steadily. Each arrival carried the same pattern: shock at the air, relief at the absence of pressure, silence afterward. Rowan adjusted interior panels incrementally as the occupancy increased, ensuring airflow remained even. The structure responded without complaint. By full nightfall, the wind had reached a sustained roar. It no longer varied in direction or strength. It pressed relentlessly, finding every sealed surface, every rigid joint. In town, the failures continued. Awnings, fences, older roofs giving way one by one. The soundscape shifted from isolated impacts to a low, continuous chorus of stress and collapse. Inside the wind house, people lay where they could, bodies close but not cramped. Lantern light flickered but held. The air remained breathable. No one attempted conversation beyond necessary words. Hank watched Rowan work and finally spoke again. You built this alone? Yes. And it's holding more people than it was meant to? Yes. Hank stared at the roofline. If I'd built like this years ago. Rowan shook his head gently. You built what you knew. Hank's jaw tightened. Knowing changes. Rowan did not argue. Near midnight, the wind intensified again, reaching a level that forced people to brace instinctively, despite the cabin's stability. The sound deepened, becoming almost physical. Dust forced its way into every exposed space outside. Then, a sound unlike the others cut through the night, a prolonged tearing, followed by a thunderous collapse. It carried weight. Finality. Thomas Hale spoke into his radio then, voice calm but firm. We've lost multiple structures on the east side, advising anyone mobile to shelter west. The radio crackled, then went silent. Minutes later, movement appeared again in the dust. More figures, more need. Rowan stood ready. Ash rose beside him. Calder snorted softly but remained steady. One of the newcomers was Margaret Ruiz, a woman in her late 60s, slight and bent but stubbornly upright. Her gray hair was cropped short, her face lined deeply by sun and years of fieldwork. She had lived alone since her husband's death a decade earlier and had refused help until the roof beams above her bedroom began to twist. She walked with a cane but did not lean on it heavily. Pride still held her spine straight. Inside the cabin, Margaret stood quietly, eyes closed, lips moving as if counting breaths. When she opened them, they were wet but steady. This place listens, she said simply. Owen nodded. It does. The wind raged through the night, unbroken. Outside, Silver Mesa suffered. Inside the wind house, people endured. Rowan did not sleep. He walked the interior perimeter repeatedly, checking joints, listening for strain. The structure responded consistently. The sound remained within acceptable range. No vibration escalated. No fasteners worked loose. Just before dawn, the wind finally eased, not stopped but softened enough to allow a change in pitch. The pressure lifted slightly. The sound shifted upward, then thinned. People noticed. Breathing deepened, muscles unclenched. Rowan wrote in his notebook as the sky lightened imperceptibly. First major failures. Structure held under sustained load. Community followed. He closed the book. Silver Mesa had lost buildings that night, but it had not lost its people. Not all of them. And for the first time since the weather began to change, survival no longer felt accidental. Morning arrived without ceremony. The light came pale and thin, filtered through dust that had not yet decided where to settle. The wind still moved across Silver Mesa, but its force had eased enough to allow sound to separate again. Boots on gravel, a door hinge creaking, a voice calling a name and receiving an answer. After the long night, those small confirmations mattered. Inside Rowan Blackwell's wind house, people woke slowly, bodies unfolded from cramped positions, joints stiff, throats dry. Yet there was no confusion, no surge to leave. The air still moved in a controlled pattern, drawing warmth upward and out, replacing it with something breathable. Lanterns were extinguished one by one. Ash rose and stretched, shook dust from his coat, and padded toward the opening, nose testing the morning. Calder lifted his head and snorted softly, the sound steady and familiar. Rowan stepped outside and took in the town. The damage was visible now that dust no longer hit it. Sections lay twisted in the street. A fence line had folded inward. Posts snapped at ground level. The hardware shed was half gone, its contents scattered like a careless inventory. Yet there were no bodies, no cries. People were moving, helping, counting each other. Sarah Lane emerged from the wind house carrying a ledger, its pages already marked. She had slept less than anyone but moved with purpose, scanning faces, checking off names. When she reached Rowan, she paused. "Everyone who came here made it through," she said. Rowan nodded. "Good." Hank Doyle stood a few steps behind her, hands on his hips, gaze fixed on the line of damaged buildings. He looked older in the daylight, as if the night had taken something he could not replace. His beard was stiff with dust, eyes red-rimmed, posture rigid, but he didn't turn away from the sight. "I walked the east side," Hank said. "Lost 5 roofs outright. 2 more compromised. Mine held, barely." He exhaled. "That opening I made saved it." Rowan did not say, "I told you so." He simply listened. Thomas Hale arrived mid-morning with a clipboard and a radio that crackled less than before. He moved carefully, stepping around debris, nodding to people as he passed. "Power's coming back in sections," he said. "We'll be down a while, but we're stable." He stopped at the wind house and studied it again, longer this time. "This structure took sustained lateral load for nearly 10 hours, he said. "With variable direction. That's not luck." "No," Rowan agreed. Thomas looked around at the gathered people. "County's going to want documentation." Rowan shrugged. "I kept notes." By midday, the wind settled into a manageable pattern. It no longer leaned on structures, it passed through them. People returned to what remained of their homes in pairs, salvaging what they could. Others stayed, helping to clear roads, stack lumber, secure loose metal. The wind house remained a center, not as a shelter now, but as a place people returned to check in, to compare notes, to rest. Jonah Reed showed up with a truckload of bottled water and tarps. His face was streaked with dust, beard uneven as ever, but his movements were more confident. "Figured this place should have supplies," he said, unloading without waiting for instruction. Clara Watkins brought notebooks and began taking names and damage reports, her practical mind already turning experience into lesson. Elias Moreno returned with tools and a quiet determination, his cattle secured, his priorities clear. Late in the afternoon, a man Rowan had never met approached on foot, walking carefully, eyes scanning the structure with professional interest. He introduced himself as Paul Serrano, early 40s, an independent builder from a town 2 hours south. He was lean, sun-browned, with sharp features and a trimmed beard that framed a thoughtful mouth. Years earlier, a poorly ventilated build had sickened his younger brother during a heat wave, an event that had pushed Paul toward studying airflow and passive cooling on his own. "I heard about this place," Paul said. "Wanted to see it standing." Rowan showed him the roof channels, the adjustable panels, the way load and pressure were separated rather than combined. Paul asked precise questions and listened closely. When he left, he did so slowly, as if committing details to memory. That evening, as the sun dipped lower and cast long shadows across broken boards and intact walls alike, people gathered again at the wind house, not out of fear, but habit. Someone cooked on a portable stove. Children sat cross-legged, drawing lines in the dirt with sticks. Margaret Ruiz rested on a crate near the opening, cane laid across her knees, watching the sky with practiced patience. "This place didn't just hold," she said quietly. "It changed how we stood." Rowan considered that. "Structures teach," Hinishitz replied. "If we pay attention." Hank approached him later when the light was low and the work slowed. He held his hat in both hands, fingers working the brim. "I spent years building heavier every time weather surprised me," he said. "Never thought about letting it pass." Rowan met his gaze. "You're thinking about it now." Hank nodded once. "I want to rebuild, different." "We'll measure first," Rowan said. "Then we'll build." The next days confirmed what the night had proven. Repairs that incorporated airflow and pressure release lasted. Those that didn't needed constant attention. The town council, informal as it was, asked Rowan to advise on temporary shelters and long-term changes. He didn't refuse, but he didn't take control either. He showed, he explained, he listened. Ash became a fixture, moving easily among people, accepting quiet hands and scraps of food. Calder remained calm, his earlier tension easing as the air normalized. The tatuputske Wind House itself took on a new role, not a symbol, not a monument, but a reference point. A week later, the county delivered materials. Paul Serrano returned with 2 apprentices. Hank Doyle brought his tools and his experience, this time willing to adjust. Together, they began rebuilding, not replicating the Wind House, but applying its principles across different needs. Roofs with release paths, walls that guided air rather than trapped it, openings designed with intention. When the work slowed, Rowan stood back and watched. The town looked different already, not in appearance, but in posture. People moved with less urgency, more awareness. They checked the sky without fear. On the 8th evening after the storm, Sarah Lane reopened her store fully. She placed a small sign near the register. Air moves. Let it. Customers smiled, not because it was clever, but because it was true. That night, Rowan sat inside the Wind House alone for the first time since the crisis began. The structure hummed softly as the evening breeze passed through. He opened his notebook and added one final line beneath the others. What yields wisely remains. He closed the book and set it aside. Outside, Silver Mesa stood, not unchanged, but informed. The wind moved on, as it always would. This time, the town knew how to listen. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, shaped by patience, humility, and the courage to listen instead of fight. Rowan didn't perform magic. He didn't pray the wind away. He simply trusted that God had already written wisdom into the world, into air, into balance, into the unseen spaces we are so often afraid to leave open. And when the storm came, it wasn't the strongest walls that saved people. It was the ones that knew how to yield. In our own lives, we face storms too. Loss, loneliness, fear, moments when everything we built feels like it's about to collapse. And maybe the quiet miracle isn't that the storm stops, but that God places one safe door in our path and gives us the humility to walk through it. If this story touched your heart, take a moment and share it with someone who may be facing a storm of their own. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you or where you're watching from. Your words might be the encouragement someone else is praying for. And if you believe, as we do, that no person, no child, and no animal should ever face fear alone, please subscribe to this channel. These stories exist to remind us that hope still stands, even when everything else falls. May God bless you, may He shelter you in times of trouble, and may He guide you gently toward the quiet miracles already waiting in your life. Amen.